First of all, I just wanted to thank the Leakey Foundation for their wonderful support for this seminar series. I cannot think of a more elegant place to be doing it in. I feel a little usurped by the bipedal penguins at the back there, who are just so cool. And I wanted also, of course, to thank the California Academy of Sciences and Zarai, my good friend, for having me here. It's a wonderful place. I'm, well, as you can tell, I'm not a New Yorker, but I live in New York. It's not been so great there this winter, so this is just wonderful and so elegant. So thank you very much. All right, the curious case of Homo naledi, our newest extinct relative. I'm going to give you a rather general talk today, but this is an extraordinary new discovery. And as my old professor, Les Ayala, used to say, I never give the same lecture twice. Our field is a dynamic one. It's one that's always changing. It's one where new discoveries can change the way that we think about things. And I'm very thankful for that because it keeps me employed, apart from anything else, which is wonderful. And it keeps it interesting. We're always finding new things. And there's two ways that you can do that. You can go out into the field and you can find new fossils, or you can analyze what you have with new techniques. And this is a wonderful example of both of those that I'm going to be talking about today. Now, when we think about human evolution, you know, we have this sort of cliched view of that we think about it. You know, we think of the Geico caveman, and we think about, you know, Fred Flintstone and the dinosaurs. We all know that's wrong. But, you know, we have this very sort of stereotypical view of it. And when we actually look at human evolution in terms of the evidence that we have today, it's a lot more complicated. And, for instance, you know, I work on bipedalism. The way that we think about this unusual form of walking around has long been discussed historically in the record. Here on the left, we have one of the first sort of artistic reconstructions of a fossil hominin. This is actually what we think Neanderthals looked like in 1906. Now we know better. They were far more sophisticated than that. And on the right there, there's the slightly speculative monogamous couple of Lucy and her male partner from the Museum of Natural History in New York. They probably weren't monogamous. But it's a very evocative reconstruction of two hominins walking across a landscape 3.2 million years ago. So these things play a very important and iconic part in the way that we think about evolution, reconstructing evolution, getting it right. And one thing I want to, and I promise not to have too many graphs today, all right? But I do want to show you this one because it's an interesting way of thinking about our past. What I've got here is time running from the bottom there up to the top. That's 7 million years ago, and that's when we think the last common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees lived. And right at the top there is today. And these bars here, what they represent is the amount of time that we think extinct relatives of ourselves lived on the planet. And these are based on the first and last appearances of these species in the record. Now, this was a situation back in the 1950s, before I was born, although my students would think otherwise. And you can see from this that there aren't that many species there, and it's quite easy to view human evolution in a rather linear way, to think about it as this gradual, sort of progressive series of evolutionary changes ending up with modern humans at the end of this sort of story. Now, we had a few early species of hominin that were discovered in Africa in the 1920s, and then a few later things which we have from Europe and we have from Asia, and then of course we end up with us who are everywhere. Well, that was in 1956. Here's the situation today. It has totally changed. And it's changed in two ways. It's changed because we now have time depth. We have creatures going all the way back to 6 or 7 million years ago. Some people argue that they're members of our lineage, other people's don't. You're always going to get those sort of arguments at the base of any evolutionary tree. So we've doubled the time depth. And the wonderful thing about that is that it ties in very nicely with what we know from studying our DNA and sort of rates of change and when we think ancestors lived. But the other thing that's fascinating, of course, is the sheer level of diversity that we see. Take a time period like here at 2 million years and go along there, and you can see there's 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 different species living on the landscape in Africa. How do they interact with each other? How did they interact with each other? What were the ecological relationships between them. We actually don't know, and we're still trying to find it out. But the key here is diversity. There are lots and lots of different species in our family tree. The tree is bushy, it is diverse, it is full of evolutionary dead ends. And it is within that context that we have to think about these new exciting discoveries that we find. It's no longer this straight progressive line. It's a bushy, messy affair, and that, to me, is fabulous. It makes it far more interesting. I think we had an overly simplistic and I think a rather human-centric way of thinking about our own evolution before. Now, that diversity is reflected in many aspects of the anatomy of these creatures. These are just pictures of skulls that we have here, and you can see just looking at them that there's many different types of forms. This is Homo floresiensis, nicknamed the hobbits from Southeast Asia. They're not hobbits, by the way, but they are a riveting species, an example of something that got to an island, got isolated, got small. Here is Paranthropus boisei, a large, diamond-faced, wide-cheeked, small-brained individual, a species that lived about the same time that the first members of our own genus, Homo, emerged onto the scene. They were very successful at what they did, and then gradually they died out. Australopithecus sediba, modern humans, and Australopithecus africanus, and many other species. There's a lot of cranial diversity. And traditionally, the way that we've thought about the species diversity within our group has been within the context of skulls and teeth. But we also have increasingly many remains from below the neck. And one of the things that I've been interested in, and indeed have been sort of working on prior to this new fossil hominin that I've gotten involved with, is actually thinking about this diversity within the context of one of the things that defines us as being human, walking around on two legs. The way that we walk on two legs, and I was telling this to high school students this morning, the way that we walk on two legs, with one leg in front of the other, not hopping like a kangaroo, that is more unusual in living mammals than laying eggs. There are two species of living mammals that lay eggs, echidnas and platypi. But the way that we move of living creatures is very, very unusual. And the fascinating thing that we're beginning to find out about it is that based on all these skeletal remains, here's Ardipithecus, here's Australopithecus sediba, many different creatures, that they were actually experimenting with walking upright in different ways to each other. So we live in very interesting times in terms of our understanding of human origins. It's complex, it's messy, and it's not just with the skulls and the teeth, it's also with those bones below the neck and what they tell us about how they're moving around in the environment. We're still working on that, and we still have to get that right before we can then go to the next in a way more interesting level, which is thinking about how that actually relates to their ecology and their biology and their behavior. Now, the story, of course, with human evolution is an African story. Whether you're dealing with the first apes or the first hominins, members of our lineage, or the first modern humans, it all starts in Africa. Africa is a sort of pump, a powerhouse of evolutionary innovation when it comes to humans and our ape relatives. And the earliest members of our lineage, and in some ways the most well-known members of our lineage, think of Lucy, for instance, are all found in this part of Africa, in many of the great Rift Valley sites, in Ethiopia, where Zerai works, and in Tanzania, and in Kenya, and in Chad. And indeed, that is where hominin evolution, our closest extinct relatives, that is where that begins. But today, we're going to be talking about material from South Africa, down here. And South Africa actually is full of wonderful and important fossil hominin sites. And some of them are very well known to some of you in the audience here. There's the famous site of Taung, Makapansgat, and then a number of sites situated outside Johannesburg. There's just a couple of names there, Sterkfontein, Swartkrans, that are iconic sites if you study human evolution. And indeed, South Africa was the first place that fossil hominins were found within the continent of Africa. It's a fascinating story. Today, the region outside Johannesburg is known as the cradle of humankind. It's a World Heritage Site. It's littered with sites, and of course the important thing is people are still actively working them. It's fascinating just to pause for a moment and think about this, because prior to the 1920s, we weren't looking in Africa for the remains of early hominins. Scientists predicted that our ancestors must either be in Europe or in Asia. They were completely wrong. And in fact, if you go back to Darwin and Huxley and the people who wrote about human evolution, based on no fossil evidence in the 1850s, they all predicted our ancestors must be in Africa. But people then ignored that, and they were looking in other parts. And nothing happened until the 1920s. And from then on, all the focus has been there. So there's an interesting historical component to this. And there's a number of sites around Johannesburg, this is just to the north of the site, that we're going to be talking about today. And in particular, one site down here that I just have a sort of anonymous star there next to for the moment. But important sites like Malapa, where Australopithecus sediba was discovered, Sterkfontein, which is one of the most important and productive sites in Africa today in terms of fossil hominins, and many others. So it's a very rich region. Now, when you go there, and some of you in this room I know have been there, you see this beautiful, bucolic landscape. Actually, to us paleontologists, it's what's underneath this landscape that's interesting, and when a lot of us look at this, what we actually see is Swiss cheese, because underneath these fields is a whole honeycomb network of cave systems. It's called a karstic cave system, and occasionally when you go up to some of these hilltops, you'll get vegetation and you'll see fissures in the ground. And those fissures relate to the fact that the rock, which is predominantly limestone, is easily soluble by water and allows for a lot of water-based erosion and the opening up of cave systems. And I have just a diagram here just to show you, this is what we call a solution cavity, and you get basically over time water-based erosion and eventually a cave system opening up to the environment and vegetation and trees growing there because there's quite a lot of water, and you get material washing into these cave systems, and with that material washes in bones and stone tools and the teeth and bits and pieces of animals that have died, and over time they solidify into a sort of rock-like substance, and then perhaps your cave roof eventually disintegrates and collapses, and by the time we get to G here, your lucky paleontologist comes along and there are exposed fossils in sort of concrete-like material there for you to excavate out. And the sites in South Africa are packed with these former cave systems and existing cave systems. Here's a couple of examples. These are both caves, these are caves in a place called Sterkfontein. It's just like a sort of open pit at the top, but you can go inside and find these wonderful systems, and they are packed full of fossils. Here's an example of a sort of 2 foot by 1 foot block of this material, and you can see these are all monkey skulls here, and these were actually brought here to Berkeley many years ago and processed and excavated away, and this block doesn't exist anymore, but we have all these wonderful fossils from them. And it's different to places like East Africa, where you have lovely sediments and you have easily datable layers and you have fossils that are very easy to place within a broader sequence. Caves are an absolute nightmare to geologists. Everything gets turned around and jumbled up, but they can be very, very rich. Now, as I mentioned, in the 1920s and the 1930s, spectacular fossils were found down in South Africa. This fellow here is called Raymond Art, and he really is the person who, in many ways, is responsible for us going to Africa and looking for fossil hominins. He was clever enough to identify this juvenile specimen as being a member of our lineage. Other people thought it was just a fossil ape or a fossil monkey initially, and indeed he showed by looking at features at the base of its skull that this little infant was in fact a biped, that it could spend some of its time walking on 2 legs. Later people, very famous paleontologists like Robert Broom, discovered grown-up versions of this same species, Australopithecus africanus, southern ape from Africa, and set the ball rolling for African paleoanthropology. And throughout the 1920s and 30s and 40s, wonderful fossils were being shoveled out of these caves in South Africa. East Africa then took over, And because of also political reasons, quite justifiably with South Africa, things dropped. Is it a battery issue? Do you want me to switch up? Sorry about that. Give me a moment. One, two. Okay, all right. We will keep the show running. All right. So, as I was saying, South Africa became a little bit. I can hold it. Even better. Do the mic drop afterwards. All right. So, South Africa became a little bit of a backwater for an amount of time, for political reasons, and of course because of spectacular discoveries that were made in East Africa. Some of Lucy, of course, in the 19. Are we good? All right. That's all right. One moment. One, two. Can you hear me? All right. Excellent. Okay. So, as I was saying, South Africa became a bit quiet for a while, and in part because of politics and in part because of wonderful discoveries at Olduvai Gorge by the Leakeys and up in northern Kenya, and then in the 70s and 80s and 90s and 2000s, wonderful discoveries in Ethiopia. And it actually is interesting because alongside these discoveries in Eastern Africa, South Africa continued to produce wonderful fossils. In the 90s, this wonderful fossilized skeleton, nicknamed as Littlefoot, rather unoriginally because it's got a small foot, this species was discovered, and there's a skull there and long bones, and it's an almost complete skeleton. This is Ron Clark, who was involved in its excavation and its discovery, and it's a magnificent discovery. It's one of the most complete skeletons in the record, and I can tell you, if you find one tooth in my field, you're pretty happy. So finding a skeleton is a pretty big deal. Hominins are generally rather rare on the landscape compared to things like baboons and giraffes and zebras. So it's always great when you find one. So when you find a complete skeleton in a cave like this, it's amazing. So they've continued to find very important specimens down there. And rather recently, just in this last 10 years, a new species of hominin was discovered down there called Australopithecus sediba. It made the copy of Science. It has a beautiful skull and a couple of partial skeletons, one of a grown-up, one of a juvenile. And it's a riveting species because it's 2 million years old, which is quite young for a member of Australopithecus. Remember, Lucy is Australopithecus. She's 3.2 million years old. And this species is experimenting in some ways with being Homo-like, with being a member of our group, but in other ways isn't, with a small brain. So it's a really fascinating and important discovery. And here's a picture of people excavating in the small pit where it was discovered. It was a chance find by the son of the paleontologist who led the work, called Lee Berger. And what we think, here's a reconstruction by National Geographic of one of the shafts in this limestone system where individuals fell down and got trapped at the bottom and died, and luckily for us, their skeletons got preserved. And here's a sort of reconstruction of what the system would have looked like back then. So a really wonderful discovery, which brings us on to the main point of today's talk. New fossil hominins from a system called the Rising Star Cave System in South Africa. Now, this is a cave system that is well known to South African cavers. The interesting thing is that cavers have been going into this cave system for many, many decades. It's popular, it's challenging in some respects. Here's a picture of a caver going through a small squeeze halfway down the system. Here's another picture from National Geographic of an excavator sitting in one of the shafts. And you can just walk into these systems and explore them. But they are not for the faint-hearted. Here's a cross-section of the Rising Star cave system, and this is 60 feet from here to here, and you have to go down here, and then here there's a little squeeze. It's about 10 inches high, which you have to squeeze through. You then have to climb up this area here called the Dragon's Back, and then we'll get onto this in a minute. This is a truly insane drop there that is at its narrowest 7.5 inches narrow. Just think about that for a moment. Now, we were very lucky because cavers were exploring this system and they came across some material right down in the bottom. This chamber we now call the Naledi chamber. Naledi is a local Sotho word meaning star, and the reason it's called that is because the system was well known amongst cavers as the rising star system, often because they were coming out of the system late in the evening and they would come out and they would see the evening star there. Now, 7.5 inches, I just want you to think about that. That's a basketball, that's just a little bit more, all right? That's what we're talking about when we're talking about these squeezes. These cavers, and I want to just show you for a moment. Whoop. How do I play this? Here. Oh, there we go. Okay, great. I wanted to show you for a moment. Cavers are, in my opinion, the second most crazy people in the world. They are completely nuts. The only people that are more crazy than these cavers are the cavers who go underwater when they do this, all right? So they're still cavers. And my understanding with the underwater caving is, there's a 1 in 10 chance that you will die when you do this. It is incredible. And this guy here, who was one of the cavers who first discovered this site, here he is squeezing through one of these insane little squeezes. Okay, it's kind of wincing, actually, when you look at it. It's really nuts. I wouldn't have, as Zerai so eloquently explained earlier, I would not fit down this place. 7.5 inches. And these guys, for reasons that are unknown to most of us, got to this tiny drop at the very end of this system, and rather than what most people would do, which is turn around and go back to light, decide, oh yeah, we'll go down there, you never know, it could be interesting. Well, and it's quite something to see this. And they found at the bottom of this cave system some broken bits of bone. Other people had been there before and trampled on them. And they had the wherewithal and the presence to actually go to a local scientist, Lieberger, and tell him, I think we've found something exciting. And they took photographs of this material, and that scientist got extremely excited about this because they realized from the photographs, I love this bit's particularly nuts, they realized that this material was not likely to be modern human, that it was probably something else. What on earth was it doing at the back of this cave system? And very quickly they arranged for a group of people to go down and to look for this material. And how do you do this? These days you do it on Facebook. Of course you do. And so what the team did, what we did is, we put out an advertisement on Facebook, and we basically said something along the lines of this. We need small-bodied people who are incredibly brave, who are also excellent at archaeological excavation and paleontological excavation and have rock climbing experience. Not what you might call a big pool to draw from, okay? And the wonderful part of this, of course, is that the 6 people that were chosen to go down there just by chance, because in general, and I know this as a paleontologist, women tend to be smaller than men, that they're all women. And it's a wonderful women in science story, this. These are all brave, intrepid, talented scientists who went down there to excavate this material. And they had to take oxygen down there because they were beginning to use up oxygen down in the chamber. You're squeezing through at the narrowest point, a very, very tiny, tight squeezes. It's more than half an hour to get down there. And these 6 brave individuals were chosen from a pool of 60 or 70 people. I couldn't imagine that there were 60 or 70 people out there who had all those skill sets, but they did. It's absolutely wonderful. And back in 2013, they went down there. They spent a month working in the cave system, exploring it, mapping it, and recovering what had been discovered at the base of it. And here are just a few pictures of them setting themselves up. They set up laptop systems. They set up scanning systems to do 3D scanning of the cave systems. Here's an earlier picture of one of them squeezing through. Here's another squeeze down there. Some of them were spending 5, 6, 8 hours a day down there. It's incredibly humid and hot, and of course, you never necessarily know that you will get out. So it's really quite impressive. The base of the chamber where the original bones were observed by the first cavers who found them looks something like this. It's a little bit washed out, but it's a pretty small area. And the initial photographs that were taken down there by professionals show quite a lot of broken bone with clean breaks and other such things. And this is because other cavers had been down there before and stuff had gotten a little bit damaged over the years, which is a great shame, but these things do happen. What matters is that it wasn't just left there, that it was reported. And they worked down there for just about a month. Here they are working with a 3D scanner, scanning the material in. And they ended up with an area. This here is the vertical drop down into the area with a whole load of fossil hominin bones over the surface and going down several feet into the sediment here at the bottom of the cave. There's a little bit of difference in terms of the age of the sediments these things are found in. We're still trying to work it out, but we think that they were probably laid over many decades, perhaps a little bit more, but not much more than that. They were quite randomly assorted. We'll get onto that in a little bit. And I want to just leave one thing with you, which we'll return to in a moment. There were only hominin remains there. And I'll add that there were 1,600 of them. As I said, you're lucky if you find one tooth. Here, in 1 month, were more remains than some sites have produced in 100 years. Absolutely extraordinary finding, and nothing else in every other South African site that we go to. Material washes in, and it's a total mixture of baboon remains and sometimes stone tools and fossil hyena teeth and yes, fossil hominins and other such material. The nature of material washing into these systems over time means that they're very random. This is not random. We found one little mouse tooth, probably got in there, and passed away, and some little bits of an owl, and that was it. 1,600 fossil hominin remains, an absolutely extraordinary discovery. The material was slowly brought to the surface. Very quickly, they could see that this was not just some unfortunate humans that got down there and got stuck. You look at this bit of skull here. This has a prominent brow ridge, a receding frontal bone there. These were quite obviously hominins that were not us. And a number of research scientists worked in tented areas to clean and conserve and identify the material. And then what happened was a really wonderful thing. The team organizers arranged for an international group of what they called early career scientists. You had to apply to go and work on this material, and we brought down a ton of scientists from around the world, experts on the hand here, like Tracy Kivel. Here's a group of people who are experts on the skull. Here's me leading the team that looked at parts of the lower limb and the foot, and this guy was working on the taphonomy of the material. This is the science of burial, people working on the teeth and the hands and all sorts. It was a wonderful experience. It was 5 weeks worth of very intense scholarship, day after day, comparing material to the existing fossils that we have, comparing it to the remains of chimpanzees and gorillas and modern humans, and trying to understand what this was. And you can see it takes an army, or at least a regiment, to really do these things well, I think. All sorts of interesting specialities came together. This is in the fossil vault down in the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. And indeed, when everything had been cleaned and analyzed and identified, it was very obvious we had an extraordinary discovery on our hands. These are just some of the remains being laid out for photographic purposes by National Geographic. And you can see there are bits of the skull and the hand and the foot and lots of teeth and long bones. Over 1,600 remains. And finally, after about a year's worth of work, this material was released to the public. We named it Homo naledi. Naledi means star in the local language, as I said already. And we were very lucky and very honored. We had a huge amount of press publicity and a huge amount of attention. I learned a new term, even for a New Yorker, which was above the fold. I didn't even know what this meant. But apparently, if you get above the fold in the New York Times, it's a big deal. So we were very excited about that. And it had all sorts of wonderful reception and interest about it. It was definitively a new species, and we'll go into why that is in a moment, and a lot of attention, and the exciting thing is that there is debate and there is a disagreement about it, as there should always be in science. Science is a tentative process, and to this day, more work is being done on it and follow-up work, and as I will explain later, we're very open access about it. Any scholar can go and work in this material. Any scholar can go down to South Africa and work on this material. This material has been put online so you can download it if you're a local school and print it out with a 3D printer. We've made it available to everyone, and it is the way to do paleontology. There's no other way, in my opinion. What can we say about this material? Well, traditionally, when we name species in paleoanthropology, we tend to use the teeth and the skulls and such. And indeed, the combination of features that we saw made this a new species. It's got a rather small brain size, around about 550 cubic centimeters. That's an awful lot smaller than ours, but a little bit bigger than you might see in a chimpanzee, but not by much. It's at the very, very lowest end of what we expect from members of our genus, Homo. It's got a rather receding forehead, and its teeth, though, are more Homo-like than not. Here's actually a picture of the reconstructed skull of Homo naledi, and I have one that I'll bring out afterwards if people would like to see it hiding under here, compared in gray here to what a human skull looks like. And you can see that it's got this rather projecting brow ridge and this rather sloping back forehead and this much smaller brain case. But of course the face was a little more what we call prognathic, a little more sort of sticking out. This is similar in some ways, a little bit, to other early members of our genus. There's a half picture of Lee Berger holding the skull at the press conference when it was announced to the world. And complex 3D analysis of the skull and the brain case and the shape of the brain indeed shows that it was quite like other members of early members of the genus Homo. Modern technology allows us to do some quite cool things. We can find one half of a skull, and we can scan it in, and we can flip it, and we can reconstruct a whole to make it a more complete skull using modern three-dimensional scanning techniques and techniques developed by the CAD and engineering industry to do better reconstructions of these things. So we live in really interesting times in terms of what we can do with this material. We found many more than one individual. I just want to show you this picture. You know, we have two sort of half-complete crania. By the way, there is more material yet undescribed that is coming out. We find material that we think were probably males and females. We're still working on that, but the number of individuals that we have from the site ranges between 14 and 18 individuals. We have everything from infants through to elderly people in this sample. So it's a really incredible sample. When we look at the teeth, something that's really, really important to look at when we're deciding on whether we name this a new species or not, we can look at Homo naledi here, and we can compare it to things like Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, or other earlier species of hominin, or contemporary species of hominin that had very large teeth, and we can see that it has greatly reduced teeth, both at the front and particularly, most importantly, at the back of the dentition. And those matter because reduced dental size is one of the sort of classic components of being a member of our genus, of being Homo, of not being Australopithecus, of not being something else. If you compare it to other species of Homo, you can see that it has rather smaller teeth, but importantly, and one of the things that we look at are the relative size of the teeth to each other, you compare it to creatures that some might argue this was quite similar to, like Homo erectus, one of the first species to leave Africa. This is a Homo erectus specimen from the site of Dmanisi in Georgia, in the Caucasus. You can see this tooth here, which is called your first molar, is quite big, and the teeth get a little smaller as they go back. That's your wisdom tooth there. Totally opposite pattern in Homo naledi. So this thing is not a Homo erectus. This is well outside the range of variation we see in these creatures. And there are other species we can compare it to, and when we combine that with very precise characters traits that we look at on all the teeth, this thing pulls out as being different. We can look at it from the side and we can compare it to members of Australopithecus, which is an important thing to compare to because this is quite a small-brained creature. We can look at the jaw profile here and we can see it's very vertical. It doesn't quite have a chin like us, but it's very different to other species. Perhaps a little different, less different to this one, but it doesn't have the canines in the same configurations we see in Naledi. And we can compare those to Homo as well, and we can see that in some ways there are more similarities, but not in all ways. And indeed, overall, when you look at the relative size of the first molar, that's one of your crushing teeth at the back of your mouth, here, compared to the cranial capacity, you can see that there's different configurations of hominins. Here's Australopithecus, who have rather small brains and rather big teeth. Here's Homo habilis from Olduvai Gorge, and here's Homo erectus, one of the first species to spread out of Africa into the rest of the world, and here's Homo naledi. It's got a rather small brain from members of the genus Homo, but it's also got rather small teeth. So it, to our mind, in combination with many other characters in the skull, is a unique species. Now, this is all material from above the neck. I'm personally rather interested in the stuff below the neck. I think that's fascinating. It tells you about how they're moving and what they're doing. What can those tell us? Well, the good news is that we have material from all over the body. We have everything from pinky bones to parts of the ribs and the vertebrae and the pelvis and such. We have particularly well-preserved hands and feet. We have just about every bone in the body preserved. Not all from the same individual, but just about every bone in the body. And it's so rare to get this within one species. There's all sorts of interesting features about it. The femur, the thigh bone, has a rather long neck. Where your thigh bone attaches to your pelvis in the ball and socket joint, there's then a sort of a neck, as it were, that attaches that ball part to the long part of your thigh that goes down to your knee. In creatures such as Lucy, that tends to be rather long, and in part that relates, we think, to the fact that they've got these rather wide, flared pelvises and these rib cages that are a little bit different to us. They're all related to each other, and these necks of these femurs of Homo naledi are actually rather long. They're longer than you would see in something such as Homo sapiens. This is actually, in some ways, a non-Homo-like trait. It's something you see more often than not in creatures such as Australopithecus. Quite interesting to think about. We have very nice pelvic remains. They're a bit fragmentary, and very early and preliminary analyses of them, looking at the cross-sectional shape of the ribs, there's Homo naledi, versus much thinner Homo sapiens morphology there. Here's part of the pelvis. That's the part of your hips that sort of flares out, and you can feel the top of them if you put your hands on your side there, the bottom of your waist. There's early indications that it might be that the pelvis of these creatures is not exactly like ours, that it was perhaps a little more Lucy-like in some ways, but that is tentative. There's still work being done on that. But it's interesting to think about. One thing we do know, based on looking at their legs, is that these creatures were undoubtedly bipedal much of the time. One feature that's very classic and well-known, and we teach in our 101 classes, is that your thigh bone in humans, this is a human skeleton here, angles in from your hip to your knee. That helps place your knees and your legs quite close to the midline of your body, and it makes it a lot easier to walk as you move along. Chimps here don't have that. Australopiths, like Lucy, actually do, and Homo naledi is no different in that respect. So there's lots of features that indicated that it was a biped, even though there were a few features that make it a little more sort of, little tiny bit more sort of Lucy-like and less like modern humans, which is interesting for a member of our own genus. I always like to slow this slide. This feature isn't just something that you inherit, it's something that's actually enforced from moving on two legs. This is the femur of a bipedal human, a human that had walked all their life. This is the femur of a human who was born paraplegic and couldn't walk on two legs ever. And what you can see is that it's absolutely straight. It's not like a bipedal modern human. And that is because it is a combination of inherited dispositions and actual enforcement through locomotion that make these features what they are. And so when we find this angle in something like Lucy, or we find it in something like Homo naledi, not only does it indicate a capacity for being bipedal, it actually indicates they were spending a lot of their time walking on two legs. Hands and feet, my bread and butter, fascinating parts of the body, super important in all primates because they're mainly the only structures that integrate with the trees and the ground when they move around. So they're very reflective of locomotion, as Zariah said at the beginning of today's talk. And we were very lucky. Here is an articulated hand found in the ground, in situ, down at the bottom of the Dinaledi chamber. The same for the foot. We found these remains all connected together, and so we are incredibly lucky in having articulated what we call associated hands and feet from Homo naledi in this space that we can analyze and sort of try and say something about. When you look at their hands, they're quite human-like in lots of ways. We have rather short finger bones compared to chimps and gorillas. And indeed, Homo naledi, in that respect, the proportions of the digits on the hands are quite human-like. There's also indications from various morphologies that we see in the thumb and in the fingers that these creatures had similar manipulative abilities to modern humans in some ways. However, really interestingly, the finger bones, when you look at them from the side, are also super curved. They're some of the most curved finger bones that we find in the fossil record. And that, of course, tells us that these creatures were still climbing a bit in the trees. This is an important feature for climbing. We see it in gorillas and in orangutans and chimps. We know from studying the growth of these creatures that they're very important and relate to actively climbing in the trees. So Homo naledi is not fully human-like. It still has in its hands some retentions that afford it the ability to climb in the trees, most likely in a way that we don't, much more than we do, I would suggest. We have analyzed the shoulder joint. We found it to be one of the most primitive shoulder joints in the hominin record. This was a creature that could reach above its head and pull itself up in the trees in a way that we couldn't. We have no evidence of this in members of our own genus up to now. So it's expanding the way that we think about it. And then, of course, there's the foot. This is an area of the body I work on. It's a beautifully preserved specimen. This is an image from the October edition of National Geographic. This is a composite, but nearly all of this is from one individual. It's beautifully preserved. And in many ways, it's one of the most human-like structures in the Homo naledi skeleton. You can look at it from the side as well, just to give you a couple of different views. We've got all these different bones, and all these bones in the foot, all your ankle bones and your metatarsals, they all are, you can analyze their shape and do 3D analyses of them and such, and they are very, very informative of different ways of moving around. They're some of the most diagnostic bones in the body when you're trying to say something about locomotion, as you would expect. Now, the feet of humans are very different to those of chimps. A chimp foot here, I love this picture. This is a chimp hand and a chimp foot. They're pretty similar, as you can tell. This is a grasping organ that's able to climb and grasp strongly in trees and help pull itself up through the trees. Our feet are very long. They are, in terms of the sort of ankle region, much shorter in terms of the toe regions. We have these stubby little toes that we can't really grip with. We have a stiff foot that we can't use in a flexible way because every time our heel strikes the ground and we move forward, our foot needs to stay stiff in order to propel ourselves forward in an efficient way. So we have all sorts of bony mechanisms and all sorts of soft tissue mechanisms and ligaments and all sorts of things to help keep that foot stiff. And there's lots of markers on the bones of human feet and chimp feet that can tell us if they were a more ape-like or a more human-like foot. And indeed, when we look at the skeletons of humans and chimps, they are very informative. You can see here, for instance, this is a human foot, and it's beautifully arched. Even if you have flat feet, it's not because of your bones, it's because of the lax soft tissues underneath. Your bones, naturally, form an arch. Chimp feet support weight in the middle part of the foot. They're flat. Of course, they also have these rather short ankle region and these rather curved toes and other features as well. So they're very, very different. And when we looked at the Homo naledi foot overall, the relative proportions of the ankle to the metatarsals and then the toe bones is very human-like. It was efficient in terms of the way that it moved forward. No argument at all. Nice news is that we actually have 5 different feet of 5 different individuals, including some juveniles. So there's ongoing work right now, and there's many other remains. These are just some of the associated skeletons where we're looking about how these things grew over time, which is really interesting. However, there are a few features that aren't human-like. Don't worry too much about, well, you can't actually read it here, but this is a measurement taken with planes that we actually fit in 3D software to curved surfaces to look at the orientations between different structures in these bones. And this particular one tells us about whether this creature would have had an arch or not. This is the human range of variation. These are chimps and gorillas. There's Homo naledi there, outside the human range, within the chimp range. So it probably was rather flat-footed. That might have had connotations for long-distance travel and other aspects of more complex bipedal behaviors. We've still got to work it out. And, very interestingly, just like the hands, when you look at the curvature of the toe bones, here's humans, here's Homo naledi. There's one outlier that's rather more human-like, but in general, the Homo naledi range of curvature is more within what we see in Australopithecus afarensis, gibbons, bonobos, and gorillas. In fact, the mean is slightly higher than gorilla, and when we do statistical tests, it's distinct from modern humans, even though there's a tiny bit of overlap. So not only are their hand bones super curved, and they have this rather primitive shoulder joint, we also see curvature on their foot bones, in their toe bones. And perhaps that might relate to a little bit of extra grasping potential in the trees. Perhaps it's just a primitive retention. We have to sort of think about that more. But really interesting that this is not fully human-like in every way. So overall, and this is an artist's reconstruction, it's a little bit speculative, but it's an artist's reconstruction of the Homo naledi body plan. Measurements of the tibia show that and femur show that it's probably had rather long legs, but it had these very muscular, more ape-like shoulders with these curved hand bones and these abilities to still climb in the trees a little more than us. Very distinct from reconstructions of Lucy, who's much shorter with a very different rib cage shape, but still also had some primitive retentions in her skeleton that allowed her to climb as well as being bipedal, or Homo erectus here, which has a very modern human-like body plan. And this is the beautiful artist's reconstruction of Homo naledi done by John Gurche, trying to bring it to life. And I love looking at these things. Even in New York, if you met this creature on the subway, I think you'd probably, be a little perturbed. I think this creature would too, but you look at it and you do see aspects of your own humanity, and I love that. It's important, and this is one of our newest relatives, if our newest relative from the fossil record. It's a fascinating find. Now, just for a moment, some of the interesting debate that's come around Homo naledi is that, well, maybe it's not a new species. Maybe it's actually a member of an existing species called Homo erectus that we see spread far and wide across Africa and Asia, ranging from about 1.8 million years through to today. Now, at this point, I want to just remind you, because I've kind of skirted the issue here, we do not have an age for Homo naledi. We do not know how old or young it was geologically. Cave systems, as I mentioned earlier on, are very difficult to date. And sometimes you get lucky and you get the right types of geology and the right chemicals in the soil and the right sequences that you can actually get something out of it and get a basic date. Or sometimes you have other animals that you can compare to better known sites that give you an indication of the age of the site. We have nothing like that for this site. So we're still trying to work out the date of this site. And I promise you, I cannot tell you, I promise you that it is coming. But one of the questions is this Homo erectus? And in part, this has been debated because there are sites like Dmanisi, this famous site in Georgia, where we have 5 skulls from Homo erectus, and there's a lot of variation there. However, part of the shape variation we see from these skulls in Georgia are because this is a very elderly individual where you've got a lot of bone reabsorption. Some of them are young, they're separate, some of them may be male and female. And in fact, when we look at the sheer combination of features in Homo naledi, in the skull, and also in the rest of the body, when you look at them in combination, and this is where it matters to look at the whole body, not just the skull. When you look at the rest of the body in combination with features in the skull, Homo naledi comes out as very distinct from Homo erectus and Homo habilis and other creatures of other members of the genus Homo. To the untrained eye, I can understand that they might even look at them and go, well, they all look pretty similar to me. But actually, when you look at the particular features they have and when you take 3D measurements of them and you look at them carefully, this is a distinct new species. There's no doubt about it, which is very exciting. And of course, we now want to know the broader context of naledi. And the date, of course, is critical here. Dates don't tell you anything about morphology. When you do your morphology and when you look at the anatomy of these creatures, you can't think about dates, you just have to think about what they look like. But if this thing is old, and when I mean old, I mean a couple of million years old, then it's fascinating because it means there's a rather basal, as we call it, a rather primitive member of the genus Homo down in South Africa, and we've always thought of Homo initially emerging in Eastern Africa. If it's young, and when I say young, I mean hundreds of thousands of years old, it's equally fascinating. I actually think it's more fascinating in a way, because what that would mean is we've got a remnant lineage of something quite primitive hanging on in southern Africa, when at the same time, the Neanderthals in Europe and Homo erectus over much of the old world and eventually modern humans are emerging onto the scene, and yet these creatures are hanging on, just like the famous Homo floresiensis the hobbits do down in Southeast Asia. And it's a fascinating to think about when we think about the ecology of these creatures and how they would have hung on and the sort of refugio environments they may have lived in. So it's a win-win situation when we think about the date. Whatever the date, it will be very, very interesting. Now, there's one final thing we need to talk about. For some people, the most interesting, but definitely the most controversial part of this story. Why on earth are there 1,600 remains, and there's more in the ground, by the way, of between 14 and 18 individuals at the bottom of this cave and nothing else, when every other South African site that we look at which produces fossil hominins in the cradle of humankind, in the region where this material was found, has a total mixture of everything. What on earth is going on? Now, to think about this, as scientists, we have to think of beyond sort of alien abduction and that sort of thing. We have to actually think about what are the possible reasons. Don't quote me on that. When we have to think about the different possibilities. And so we can think about the fact that they might have been living there. Sure, great. We can think about maybe they were washed in during a flood. We can think of predators perhaps gobbling them up and leaving their skeletons at the back of the cave and then falling down there. We can think of perhaps what we call a mass fatality, a death trap, them getting trapped down there somewhere and all dying. And we can also think about deliberate disposal. There is no evidence of occupation. There's no evidence of any form of living in there. No stone tools, no cut-marked bones, nothing to indicate habitation whatsoever. This is also a rather remote part of the cave. Yes, the geology might have been different back then, and it might have been easier for them to get in there. I suspect it probably was. There's no evidence of water transport. We have looked very carefully at the way that the bones are deposited and the surface features on them and such, and there is no evidence they were carried there by water. There's no evidence in the way that they were broken that they were carried up there by water. I am not an expert on that, I hasten to add. But our taphonomists, our experts on the science of burial, have looked at this very carefully. There's absolutely zero evidence of predator accumulation. If you were to see that, you'd expect to see carnivore gnawing marks on the bones. And we have a very good understanding of what those look like. We can distinguish between the cut marks of stone tools and the cut marks of a careless archaeologist with a dental pick, and the cut marks produced from a carnivore gnawing on the bones. And there's none of those, not any type of scratches or cut marks or evidence of any form of butchery, whether by other hominins or whether by carnivores there. And careful analysis of the geology and the depositional environment of this material shows that this was not all deposited at the same time, that it accumulated over many years, probably decades, perhaps a little longer. And so, in a Sherlock Holmes sort of way, if you're left with the impossible, however improbable it is, it may well be the most parsimonious way that we can explain the accumulation of this material. And so we are left with this possibility that in some way these materials were being deliberately deposited. Whether by this species or another, we don't know. And I want to be very careful here and say that this is not burial. This is not deliberate burial. But we are seeing these remains repeatedly thrown down this shaft. How they got there, we still don't know. It's possible that they were thrown down somewhere else and then moved into that cave. That's a hypothesis that's been recently suggested. And there are very practical reasons why you might want to get rid of a dead body, after all. It smells, it's bringing in predators, who knows? But here is this potentially quite complicated behavior that we up to now only saw in much larger-brained, more sophisticated members of our lineage, things that looked much more like us than not, in a creature with a brain 2.5 times smaller than us, down in South Africa, perhaps recently, perhaps quite a long time ago. And it really sort of makes us rethink about, I think in some ways, what it is to be human, which is sort of a fascinating prospect. And so, rather controversially, this image was put out in National Geographic. Here's our hominins. It's a little bit like the deposition of Christ, I know. But you have to bring these things alive. And it is quite possible that they were disposing of their dead, perhaps not for emotional or religious, or no one wants to go there saying that. But for whatever reasons, we need to think about why you would get all these remains down there and nothing else. And the only thing I would say to detractors about this is, great, let's have a debate, but you need to come up with a better explanation than this, because right now this is the best explanation we can come up with. And it really is sort of fascinating to think about. So overall, there is strong evidence that Homo naledi is a new and valid species. I think it's particularly interesting because the combination of features that we see in this species expands the way we think about our own genus, the genus Homo. The deliberate disposal is, at the moment, the least unlikely way to explain what we see there. And here's the really cool bit. There is more to come. There is a ton more stuff. There is a second chamber that we have discovered. I cannot tell you more. I really will get killed if I do that. But watch this space. Thank you very much.